Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting to you live out of Kingston, Texas, USA, with another episode of Torah Talk. Live coming to you from Canada, our beloved Rabbi Michael Skobac, the one and only. Rabbi, how are you tonight? So good to see you.
Baruch Hashem. Thank God. It's great to be here with you.
Awesome. It really is. And I totally am going to enjoy it myself. I don't know who has more fun, me or you. Oh, I get the front row seat, so it's kind of nice. So let me do one thing here as we get going. Let me pause. Oh, see, I got too many mice and too many screens. Literally, there's 4 monitors and two mouses or mice. What do you call multiple mice? Mouse? Yeah, that thing that you use.
Mice.
Even with the techno gear. I know that's retarded. Okay.
Rodents.
Right. I love it. That's great. Okay, so I got 4 computers and 2 rodents.
And a partridge in a pear tree.
That's great, Rabbi. Oh my goodness gracious. Okay, well, so this week we're going to run up on Chayei Sarah. And so for all you who are watching this series Torah Talk for the first time, we're going to try to have each week's Torah portion out there for you. A different rabbi each week. We'll get Rabbi Skobac in here as often as possible. I know his schedule is pretty well flying out there. If you want to call in, the number's on your screen, 855-95-BIBLE. And that translates to 855-952-4253. And so if you're shy and don't want to do that, you can send your questions to Tanakh Talk questions@gmail.com, TENAKTALK questions@gmail.com. So without further ado, Rabbi, I'm going to let you take it off because it looks like this is going to be a fun Torah portion.
Well, I'm not sure I would call this a fun Torah portion. It's actually Chayei Sarah literally means the life or the lives of Sarah. And it's obviously a very ironic title for this week's portion because it begins by dealing with her death and burial. So it's sort of a strange title to give a chapter that's going to be dealing with someone's death and burial, to call that chapter the life of Sarah. It is ironic. And you find the same thing later on in Genesis chapter 47, verse 28, which is the Torah portion called Vayechi, which means, and he lived, which is the chapter dealing with the sickness and death of Jacob. So for some reason, the Torah has these portions that discuss the passing and the burial of these great patriarchs and matriarchs, and yet the chapter's title speaks about life. I mean, one of the things that our sages say is that for righteous people, even when they're dead, they're still alive. So there is, not so much irony here. So I want to just give an overview of the portion before we dive into it.
Hey, Rabbi, I'm sorry, and I really hate interrupting you, but can you do me a quick favor? Can you just briefly tell us where we ended as we're approaching Chayei Sarah?
I'm going to in a minute because it's part of my introduction. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir.
So, as I said, there are 3 major themes. I can't give you everything that happens, but there are 3 major parts to this chapter. The first, as I mentioned, is that it begins by focusing on the death and burial of Sarah. The major part of this portion, which takes up the vast majority of it, is it deals with Abraham trying to find a wife for Isaac, for his son Isaac. Now, there is a connection between this story and the end of last week's portion. The end of Vayera, basically, in chapter 22 of Genesis, was this very, very difficult, almost impenetrable story of the binding of Isaac, when Abraham is commanded by God to take his son Isaac up onto the top of Mount Moriah and to bring him as an offering. It's an extremely difficult passage. But there's really 2 things going on there when you think about it, because according to our sages, Isaac was not a little kid. Many people think that Isaac was, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. According to the majority view, according of rabbinic and traditional chronology, Isaac was 37 years old at this point where his father brings him up to Mount Moriah. And so obviously, the immediate problem is that, God had promised Abraham to be the founder of a great nation, of a great people, and yet, the big problem is, he's 100 years old and his wife is in her 90s and they don't have any kids.
Right.
So they have a child through another wife that's brought in, and that child, Ishmael, clearly, is not going to get the nod, because when a child is finally born to Abraham and Sarah, Ishmael is mocking this child, Yitzchak, and God tells Abraham to send this child, Ishmael, and his mother Hagar out into the wilderness. So, the drama of last week's portion was, who's going to really carry on this mission that Abraham was given. Abraham was going to be the founder of a great nation. He was told that through his nation, all the world is going to be blessed. And there's no progeny, there's no descendants. And finally, at very, very old age, him and his wife Sarah have this child, Isaac. And that basically seems to be, where it's going to have to happen, meaning the continuity is going to be through Isaac. And then you have this tremendous problem that God now tells Abraham to slaughter Isaac. So that seems to put a tremendous crimp into this future of this people. But there's another problem. Aside from the fact that God, commands Abraham to slaughter Isaac, to sacrifice him, there's another problem, which is that even if he didn't say anything, even if God didn't tell Abraham to kill Isaac, Isaac is 37 years old. He's almost 40 years old now, and he's not married. And so, another concern that sort of is hiding behind the scenes is what's going to be with Isaac, meaning that, he could still be alive, but if he doesn't get married and have children, there's going to be no continuity through him either. So what's very interesting about the story of the binding of Isaac is that he's on the altar, and God ultimately sends an angel to stop the sacrifice. But what's amazing in terms of the timing is that what happens immediately after this story, it almost sounds like it doesn't belong there. At the end of last week's Torah portion, really it should have ended with the binding of Isaac and Abraham doesn't kill him, and that would be a great conclusion. But it goes into this little genealogy portion, which seems to come out of nowhere, and it describes the birth of Rifka. Now, we don't know why that's there, as we're reading it, but we do know why, because we know that ultimately Rifka is going to become the wife of Isaac. And so what's really amazing about this story is that Abraham thinks on some level that, the great test here, the great problem, is that God is asking him to sacrifice Isaac. And, he thinks that by sacrificing Isaac, he's going to lose everything. That's why it's such a tremendous test. But what's interesting is that it seems that the only way Isaac was going to be able to continue is by getting married. And his marriage partner did not come into the world until that moment that Abraham brought him up as a sacrifice. And then ended up not sacrificing him.
Wow.
And so often in life, we think that there's something that we need and we have to have it and we won't be able to live without it. And it turns out that our spiritual growth really is not going to happen until we give it up. And so Abraham really has to give up Isaac. And it's only after he gives him up that Rebekah is born at that moment.
Wow.
And then the story can continue in this week's Torah portion, where now Isaac has to end up meeting this woman that was destined for him. So really the major part of this week's Torah portion deals with Abraham's struggles and attempts to find an appropriate wife for his son Isaac. And then the chapter ends with the deaths of both Abraham and Ishmael. That's almost like sort of tacked on at the end of the story, although the death of Abraham is a significant event, obviously. So I wanted to focus on, if we could, maybe 3 or 4 issues in the Torah portion. You know, when you're giving a discussion, when you're having a class on the Torah portion, there's almost an infinite number of things that you can speak about. It's quite amazing that, you know, you can probably see some of my library from the camera. You're only seeing about 1/10 of my library. And I have hundreds of books on the Torah portion. And it's just a drop in the bucket. There are so many questions and angles to discuss. So I just chose 3 or 4 that I find interesting, but it surely does not exhaust the things that can be discussed. So the first thing I wanted to mention was that in our rabbinic literature, in the Mishnah, Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, in chapter 5, Mishnah 3, we're told that God tested Abraham with 10 tests. It doesn't enumerate what those tests were, but it says that God tested Abraham with 10 tests and that Abraham passed them all with flying colors. Now, if people try to figure out what were the 10 tests of Abraham, you know, almost everyone agrees about what was the last test. What was the 10th and final test? Almost all the commentaries say that it was the test of the binding of Isaac. Meaning that when you go through the life of Abraham, there are many things he's told to leave his father's home and his birthplace. That's difficult, and he, you know, has to deal with the famine in the land, and many things happen. His wife is kidnapped. He goes through a lot of difficulties, but almost all the commentaries say that the final, you know, test and sort of the greatest test that he had to go through was when God asks the impossible of him, which is to bring his son Isaac up on the altar. However, one commentary says, no, that wasn't the final test. That was only the 9th test. And Rabbeinu Yonah, great sage from approximately 1,000 years ago, he says that really the last test of Abraham was not to bring his son up on the altar and to bring him as an offering, but he says the final test was Abraham's having to purchase a burial plot for his wife Sarah, and to you know, and to deal with the unsavory shenanigans of a person like Ephron. Ephron was not such an easy guy to deal with. Now, that's what Rabbeinu Yonah says, that it wasn't, the last test was not the binding of Isaac, it was having to purchase a burial plot for Sarah. But when you think about it, that seems to be an incredible anticlimax. I think that it makes sense to say that the last trial, the last test, was the greatest test, the hardest test. And it's hard to understand, why is he saying that, no, the last test was not that from last week's Torah portion. It was at the beginning of this week's Torah portion where Abraham has to find a burial plot for Sarah, and he has to deal with this unsavory character. I think one way of approaching this question is to look at, and we don't need to see this on the screen, I'll just cite it. Later on in Genesis chapter 37, which begins the whole story of Joseph. So that chapter 37, verse 1, it says, Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz migurei aviv be'eretz Canaan, that Jacob dwelt in the land of the sojournings of his fathers in the land of Canaan. And, you know, he had been on the run for so many years, and now he wants to dwell, he wants to settle down. And the sages say, and Rashi on his commentary quotes the sages of the Midrash, and they say something surprising. They say, Bikesh Yaakov leishev b'shalva. It's not just that he wanted to now, you know, settle in the land of Canaan, but they take the word leishev to settle down in the sense of to take it easy, meaning that they say that he had a very, very difficult life. When you think about it, he begins his life struggling with his brother. This was not a conscious struggle, but they're in the womb. They're both of them in the womb. They're twins. And it says that they were running, in the womb. They were sort of struggling within the womb itself. And then as they get older, there's this whole drama about who's going to get the blessings of Isaac. And then after, he has to basically deceive his father Isaac to get the blessings, turns out that his brother Esau has it in for him, and Esau wants to kill him. So he has to flee. He has to leave his father's home, and he's away for over 20 years. And then he has to deal with the horrible treatment of his father-in-law, Laban. He's tricked by Laban. He wants to marry one daughter. He gets the other daughter. And then he's treated horribly in terms of having to take care of the sheep. And he's really not being paid properly. And then he finally gets so bad that he has to flee his father-in-law. But then he has to go from the fireplace into the fire, or how he has to go from one terrible thing to the next, and he's fleeing from Laban, and now he has to meet up with his older brother Esau, who he assumes wants to kill him. He finally gets through that crisis, but then he has to deal with the kidnapping and rape of his daughter Dinah, and then he deals with the treachery of his sons Shimon and Levi, who basically wipe out the entire people of the family of Hamor and all those people in Shem. And then he has to deal with the death of his own wife, Rachel. And then he has to deal with his father's death, Isaac. All that happened to him. And finally, after all of that, it says that he went to dwell in the land of the sojournings of his fathers. And what the rabbis say is that he sought now, finally, to just settle down in peace. He had such a difficult life. It was so much torment and so much struggle, and it was so difficult, and he finally felt, it's enough already. Let me have some peace in my life. And so they say that in this chapter, he desired to settle down in peace, but then immediately the Midrash says, and Rashi quotes this, that God brought upon him the entire episode of Joseph. And immediately after this verse about desiring to dwell in the land of the sojournings of his fathers, it speaks about how Joseph was taking care of the sheep with his brothers, and we know what happens, that the brothers end up selling Joseph as a slave down to Egypt, and Jacob thinks that Joseph is dead. It's a very, very horrible, tragic time in Jacob's life. But we see from here that the struggles of life don't come to an end. And so when Rabbeinu Yonah says that the 10th test was the test of having to, after the whole 9 trials he'd been through already, and the final trial had been having to take his son up and offer him on the mountain as a sacrifice, and you could think that Abraham, after all this, would already feel enough already. I've gone through enough. I've been through so much. I've sacrificed so much. I've passed all these tests. Let me just now live out the last few years of my life in peace, just to have, a little bit of tranquility in my life. And so, according to Rabbeinu Yonah, that's exactly the test. The test is for a person to realize that the tests are never over. That even though it would be normal for a person after they've gone through so many incredibly difficult trials and tribulations and tests, to think at some point, okay, enough already. I put in my dues, and now let me, retire and play golf, whatever. And what the last trial is, it's saying to him, no, Abraham, even though you've gone through 9 trials, you've even had to go through that terrible torment of taking your son up to the mountain to sacrifice him, don't think that it will come to an end. No, your trials will never come to an end. And basically, the nature of life is that every single moment we're being tested. And the rabbis say that the greater a righteous person is, the greater their challenges become. And so Abraham, to his very, very last breath, basically has to understand that it's never over. that there's never a time to kick back. There's never a time to relax. There's never a time to retire from life. And that basically life is a test that's a constant test, and it's never over. And that's really the lesson for all of us, that, you know, people often think that I'm going to put in my dues and then someday I'm just going to just relax, take it easy. And the Torah is basically saying that that's not really life. You never really retire. Life is not something that we can retire from. So we move on now to what for many people is not really a big problem, but I was always bothered by the next topic I wanted to discuss, which is Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac. Now, the Parsha, nowhere in this chapter does it tell you the name of the servant. It doesn't ever name him. It just calls him Abraham's servant. But we always assume that it's talking about Eleazar,
right?
Because back in chapter 15, verse 2, we were told that Abraham's main servant was Eleazar. So we know from previous chapters the name of Abraham's servant, and that's who we assume is now accepting this mission that Abraham gives him to find a wife for Isaac.
You know, Rabbi,
Now,
I heard that from the time that Isaac was born, and I may be off on this, but from the time that Isaac was born, that was actually when they stopped, when the Torah stopped naming Eleazar, was because before Isaac's birth, Eleazar was the beneficiary of Avram Avinu. And then after Isaac was born, there was no need to continue pointing him out by name. I don't know how accurately I just pointed.
it's an interesting thought.
So,
very interesting thought. You know, you can imagine he's in a pretty difficult situation. You know, imagine any one of us, you know, a good friend or a relative asks us to go find them a wife, you know, and not in town. You have to leave and go somewhere else. So, you know, imagine you're living in Texas and you have to find a wife for your best friend somewhere in New York or California. You don't know anyone there. How are you going to choose a wife? So that's what Eleazar had to do. He was in a difficult slot. He had to somehow come up with a way of finding an appropriate wife for Isaac. So if you have on the screen chapter 24, verses 12 to 14, this paints the scene where Eleazar is at the watering hole. You know, all these towns back then in these cities.
I'm sorry, what verse did you say?
I believe it's chapter 24, verse 12. I think is where this piece begins.
And he said, "O Lord God of my father, Master Abraham, I pray thee, send me good speed this day, and show kindness to my master." No, this is where he's on his journey, right?
Well, he's now praying, and he's at this point he's at the well, and you know, this is, first of all, most towns, this is the meeting place. And, you know, obviously he's been traveling, so he stopped probably to get some water as well. But he basically comes up here with his strategy. How is he going to choose a wife for Isaac? So the key verse is verse 14, where he says, you know, I'm going to see the girls that come out to the well. The girls would come out and get water. And he says here, if I say to one of these women, tip over your jug and let me have a drink. And she, the girl, replies, drink, and I will also water your camels. She'll be the one that you've designated. I think that here, again, he's trying to come up with a plan. How am I going to choose a wife for Isaac? And now he says, look, I'm going to be at this well, and I know that there are going to be the women from the city, from the town. They're going to come to collect water at this well. So he makes up a test here. And he says that, you know, I'm going to see, you know, if I ask someone for a drink, if they can give me a drink of water, if they decide, if they say, you know what, not only will I give you water, but I'm also going to water your camels as well. So Eleazar at this point says, that's going to be, I know that's the woman, that's the right woman for Isaac. I don't think that many people have given this a second thought, and it might surprise them to know that there are many Jewish sources, most famously Maimonides, the Rambam, who says that by devising this kind of a sign, where he made up a sign for himself, Eleazar violated a biblical prohibition against nichush, which is divination or superstition. You find this in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 26. It's also repeated later on in Deuteronomy chapter 18, I believe, where the Torah prohibits certain kinds of superstitious practices. And one of them is divination. And some define divination as this kind of making of a sign that, if such and such happens, I'll do such and such. And according to Maimonides, what Eleazar did here, which seemed innocent. I don't think many people read this story and they can't imagine he did something wrong, but Maimonides says that Eleazar violated a biblical prohibition by setting up this kind of a sign. Now, many, many other commentaries disagree strongly with Maimonides, and they say no, he wasn't engaging, obviously, in any kind of superstitious practice. This was not some kind of occult practice that he was setting up for himself. What he came up with was a very meaningful test, a personality test, if you will, to really see a character test, to see who would be appropriate. We know that of all the character traits of Abraham and Abraham's legacy, we know that chesed, kindness, was his trump, his major suit. Abraham, we see in all the stories about him, went out of his way to do kindness, to welcome guests into his house. Even he had just been circumcised and he was in great pain. He's running around getting food for these guests.
Right.
And when Eleazar is trying to figure out who would be an appropriate match for Abraham's son, probably he's assuming that Abraham's son is going to carry on that legacy of kindness, of chesed. So Eleazar feels that if he can find a woman who exemplifies this trait of chesed, of kindness, that would be a great match for Isaac. So he sets up this character test to see, is this girl that I'm going to meet at the well, will she be generous enough not just to offer to give me water to drink, but to also water my camels? That is certainly going to be the wife for Isaac. And so they say that the prohibition of nichush, of divination, is only when the test is not intrinsically meaningful. For example, Rashi, in his commentary to the Talmud, says that if a person makes up a sign like, a deer crosses my path, well, if that happens, I'm not going to travel today. If a black cat crosses my path, I'm not going to invest today. That's a sign that is not intrinsically meaningful. It's totally irrelevant. And therefore, to base your decisions in life upon a meaningless test like that would be considered superstitious. However, if a person says, the storm clouds are gathering and the weatherman's predicting horrible thunder and lightning storms, so for the person to say, maybe today is not the day to go on that cruise, that's not divination. That's not superstition. They've made a meaningful decision based upon a meaningful sign. So we have here a dispute between Maimonides, who feels that what Eleazar did was improper, and most of the other commentaries who feel, no, this is not divination. This was a meaningful character test, and you can't hold him, you can't complain about what Eleazar did. So now we are basically thrown back to understanding Maimonides, meaning that if it seems so reasonable that Eleazar was doing something perfectly legitimate, he devised a totally meaningful character test for these women. So how is it possible for Maimonides to object? How could he insist that this is divination? So I want to suggest two possibilities. One is, if you look very carefully at the test that Eleazar devised, and look carefully at the words, he doesn't say that the girl who will give me water and who will also water my camel will be the one for Isaac. He expresses it in the sense of the girl who will say that not only will I give you water to drink, but I will also water your camels. Maybe that's the problem, meaning that it's not based here upon action. The actual formulation of Eleazar's test is on intention, expressed intention. And the problem is that we always know that people might talk a good game, but they don't really follow through. We see this at the very beginning of the Torah portion this week, where Abraham is trying to find a burial plot for his wife Sarah, and Ephron at first seems very magnanimous. Sure, I'll give you the cave, I'll give you the field. I mean, at first, Ephron seems to be offering Abraham the sky, everything, not just a cave, but even a whole field that goes along with the cave for free. And then we know at the end he doesn't give it for free. He charges an exorbitant price. So the truth of the matter is that people might offer things, but they don't really necessarily follow through. And maybe Maimonides is objecting to that, because the test, if you just read the words of Eleazar's character test, it's based upon what this girl will say. And he doesn't formulate it as what's going to actually happen. Maybe that's one concern of Maimonides. Another possibility is that Maimonides, and it's actually reflected in the Midrashim. The Midrash basically speaks about a number of people who made improper requests. For example, Jonathan, when he went to fight against the enemies of Israel, he was with his sword bearer, and he makes a whole test. If we shout out to them and they say we're going to come to you, you read the story there. He's also making a sign. Whether or not we should attack is going to be dependent upon what these people say. So the Talmud says that many of these stories where people make a sign are not appropriate. And the Talmud said, the Midrash says, that the problem here is that, sure, here this girl is going to feed his camels, but you know what? There's more to life than whether or not the girl happens to be kind. There could be 5 things that are wrong with her, but she happens to be kind. The Midrash says, what if she was a slave girl? Or what if she was, blind? Not that blind people should not get married, but, there could be a whole catalog of things that are wrong with her that are inappropriate. Maybe she's not very bright. And yet Eleazar seems to be putting all his eggs into this basket that, if she acts kindly, then I know she's the right woman. And maybe Maimonides feels that, just testing for one thing is not enough to really determine that someone is a marriage partner. It would be like the kind of person that, bases his decision or her decision upon who to marry on whether the person is physically attractive. Well, maybe that's an important factor, but there have to be many, many other considerations other than simply whether the person's physically attractive. So maybe that's another possibility that Maimonides is concerned about. Maybe the fact that just testing for someone's kindness may not really be that meaningful in terms of determining whether someone is really the proper marriage partner. So here we're back really with the position of Maimonides, that maybe what Eleazar did was inappropriate. So let's try to see, is there any way of now reading the story where, no, Eleazar didn't do anything that was inappropriate, and we could sort of overcome the objections of Maimonides. So one thing to understand is that the prohibition of nichush, the prohibition against divination, is only when you completely rely on that test. But if you don't completely rely on that test and you rely on other factors as well, then you're not really guilty of divination, because that's not the entire deciding factor of how you're going to behave. So many commentaries point out that Eleazar was not really relying entirely on just this test of kindness, because he also spoke with Rebecca, and he was able to look at her and see, what she looked like, and he was able to determine more about her personality by speaking with her. And then he wanted to find out who her family was. He wanted to make sure, for example, that she came from the family of Abraham. So it was only after all these other things that Eleazar really felt confident that this is the appropriate wife for Isaac. Another approach that's taken by the commentaries is that he didn't fully rely upon this test, but really his assumption was that because Abraham was so righteous, that because of Abraham's merit, God would ensure that the girl that he would end up meeting would be an appropriate match, meaning that he designed this test to test for kindness, but Eleazar, as far as he was concerned, wasn't relying entirely on his test. He assumed that God would direct the appropriate girl to him because of Abraham's great righteousness. Another approach taken by the commentaries is that he didn't rely entirely on this test, because the truth is, this test he set up, if we look at verse 12, was really stated in the context of a prayer. He really was praying to God. He wasn't simply devising this little, experiment that was going to be the sole determination. He begins by praying to God, and he's basically asking God to really ensure that his efforts will bear proper fruit. So he wasn't necessarily relying on this test. He was relying primarily on his prayer to God, which is obviously okay. One final idea, which is very interesting, is that when we go back to the beginning of the story, we know that Eleazar expressed some concerns to Abraham. When Abraham first gave him this mission to go and find a wife and bring her back here, Eleazar, we'll discuss this in a few minutes in greater detail, but Eleazar says to Abraham, but what if the girl won't want to come back with me? I mean, I might find someone, but maybe she'll be very happy where she is, and she doesn't want to travel all the way back here to meet some man that she doesn't know. So Eleazar expressed this concern to Abraham that, it's not so simple that the girl's going to agree to come back here. So some of the commentaries point out that he wanted to be able to prove, Eleazar wanted to be able to prove to the girl's family that this match was preordained and that they really should take the match very seriously. So what happened is Eleazar set up this kind of a test, not so much for his own sense of determining who the proper match was, but the test would really help sell the whole process to the girl's family. And we see that's what happened. We see that later on, when Eleazar goes back with Rifka to her family, and he tells the family this whole story. He says, look, I was standing by the well, and I said, that the girl who is willing not only to give me water, but to also water my camels, I know that's the right girl. And Eleazar says, and at that moment, your daughter, right, your sister, your daughter, she comes over, Rebecca, and she immediately, as soon as I make this test, she's the one that comes by and immediately offers to feed me and my camels, to give us water. So I knew that that was really meant to be. And we see later on that when he tells them this story, they're very impressed by this. They seem to feel that, wow, this man comes to us from out of town. He makes this test, and immediately the test is fulfilled. And we see later on in chapter 24, verse 50, that her family says, Me Hashem yotza hadavar. Right? They expressed the confidence that it's clear that this all came about through the hand of God. So his making up of this test really was a way not so much of determining who, I mean, that was part of the consideration, but it was not fully the way he determined who's going to marry Isaac, but the test was really to be able to then tell this over to the girl's family in order to help convince them that they should agree to the marriage, they consent to the marriage. So really, what we have at the end of the day is this dispute over whether or not what Eleazar did was proper or improper. There are opinions which take him to task for employing divination, but it seems that the consensus of the commentaries is that no, what he did was perfectly correct and reasonable. The next piece I wanted to look at is, it's interesting when you read this chapter. An editor might have a hard time with it because chapter 24 is an extremely long chapter, because basically it gives you the same story told twice. It tells you the whole story of Abraham sending Eleazar on the mission, and it gives you the whole story of the mission and what happens. And then you have Eleazar coming to the home of Rebekah and repeating the entire story to her family. One of the things that the commentaries do, and it's an incredible exercise, is to compare the differences between what actually happened and the way Eleazar tells the story. The differences are very, very significant. I wanted to look at one of them, and it's actually quite fascinating, but I'm going to have to warn all the viewers that it's a little bit hard to follow. So hopefully, William, if we can get the graphics up for this, it'll make it easier. But in chapter 24, verse 39, now this is in the part of the chapter where Eleazar is recapitulating the whole story to Rebekah's family. He tells them, right, what his discussion with Abraham had been. He tells Rebekah's family that this is part of his discussion with Abraham. So in chapter 24, verse 39, Eleazar says, Vayomer, he said, and I said, right? So now again, remember, he's speaking to the family of Rebekah, and he says, but he's telling them what happened when Abraham was sending him on the mission. So he says in verse 39, and I said, Vayomer El Adoni, I said to my master, Ulai Lo telech ha'isha acharai. Perhaps, they've translated here, peradventure. I never heard anyone speaking in modern English this translation, peradventure. But really, perhaps, maybe, the girl will not want to follow me. She will not want to, come back with me to your house, Abraham, my master. So he basically tells Rebekah's family that this was one of his concerns when Abraham gave him the mission. Now, the commentaries point out, this is found in Rashi's commentary, that the word here, perhaps, peradventure, maybe, that word in Hebrew, ulai, is spelt unusually, and it can be read, because Hebrew words can be read differently because there are no vowels in the actual text. All you have are consonants. So the word ulai can be pronounced here as Eli. Eli would mean to me. So again, the text reads, that Eleazar is saying to Rebekah's family that when Abraham gave me the mission, so I said to my master, perhaps, maybe, the woman will not want to follow after me, meaning to come back with me. However, the rabbis point out that this word perhaps or maybe or peradventure it's spelled unusually. We'll see in a minute how it's normally spelled. It's spelled unusually, and it can be read here as Eli, which would mean to me. Now, the rabbis run with this, and here's what they say. The rabbis say that Eleazar himself had a daughter, and that his secret wish, his secret desire, was that this mission that he was on would fail. He wasn't really hoping that he'd be able to bring back a wife for Isaac.
Right.
And his secret desire, he was harboring almost a secret wish that the mission would fail, and that that really Isaac would be a lie to me. I think that he was hoping that Isaac would end up marrying his daughter.
Interesting.
So that's suggested again simply because the word here in the verse, in verse 39, which actually is a word meaning perhaps or maybe she won't come back, because it's missing a letter, we'll see in a moment, it can be read as Eli, which means literally to me. And in his mind, that's what he was hoping, that Isaac would be to me, that your son Abraham would be to me. Now, if we look earlier in the story, not where Eleazar is retelling the story to Rebekah's family, but if we go back to the very beginning in verse 5, which is where Abraham is first giving the mission, and Eleazar is first expressing this concern. So there, the word is spelled properly, meaning it's spelled in the normal way, where it has the letter Vav between the Aleph and the Lamed, and there's no question that it's pronounced Ulai, Ulai, meaning that verse 5, it can only be read as Ulai. In verse 39, you can read it either as Ulai or Eli, but verse 5 clearly says that perhaps the woman will not be willing to follow me back to this land. So what we have here, just to summarize to this point, is we have the story that originally took place where Abraham sends him on the mission. And at that point, when Abraham is sending him, he expresses his concern, maybe the woman will not come back with me. Later on, when he tells the story over to Rebekah's family, and he repeats, he says, I told my master, perhaps the girl will not want to come with me. There, the Torah spells the word differently, really defectively, because it's missing a letter. That missing letter really forces you to read the word as ulai, which again only means peradventure or perhaps or maybe. But without that letter in verse 39, it can be read as Eli. And so the rabbis teach us in the Midrash, and Rashi quotes this, based upon this verse 39, that Eleazar had a daughter, and his secret desire was that he would fail in this mission to bring back a girl for Isaac, and that Isaac would end up marrying his daughter. Now, before I go on, I want to just point out something that the Vilna Gaon, the Gaon of Vilna, who lived about 300 years ago, he points out that this whole idea about Eleazar having a secret wish to fail in his mission, you don't need this weird spelling of the word ulai, Eli, to figure out that something is up. Because he says that there are two words in Hebrew for perhaps or maybe. One is ulai. Now, ulai really, it's interesting. Ulai means perhaps or maybe. But, when you say maybe something is going to happen, deep down inside, maybe it is going to happen. So when a person uses that word ulai, it sort of indicates that he's not really hoping it doesn't happen. You know, he's just saying, maybe, perhaps, the girl will not come back with me. But he's not saying, God forbid, it should never happen that the girl won't come back with me. It's sort of possibly she won't, but maybe she will. There is a Hebrew word which would have been much stronger to show that he was very much afraid that the woman would not return with him, which is the word pen, lest.
Right.
And he could have said to Abraham, lest, that God forbid, it has the sense of, what if she doesn't? And in the sense of, and I'm very concerned about that. I'm concerned that she won't. Whereas the word that he used, ulai, is sort of less forceful, and it leaves open the possibility, that, okay, I sort of, hopefully she won't. Maybe she won't. Maybe she won't. But it's not a great desire that she won't. So the Vilna Gaon says that you just see from his very language that he is not expressing any great concern that the girl won't come back with him. Now, here's the question I wanted to raise, which is a difficult question. It's not so easy to appreciate, but I think it's worth working on this. You see, what we just saw was that in the word that's used, ulai, there were two different spellings. The spelling initially in verse 5, clearly means perhaps or maybe. Later on in verse 39, it could be read as Eli to me. And so based upon that possibility of reading the verse as Eli to me, that's where the rabbis suggest that he had a hidden agenda. He had a hidden motive. The $54,000 question is this. Why does the Torah write the story in a way where the word is spelt defectively in verse 39, but not back in verse 5? That you would think that the place where the Torah should hint at the fact that Eleazar had a wish and a hidden agenda and a secret desire that the plan not work out, not be successful, really the Torah should have hinted at that back in verse 5, meaning that when Abraham first sends him on the mission, and he, hoping all along that his daughter would be the one to marry Isaac, why didn't the Torah spell the word ulai defectively back in verse 5 as a way of hinting Eleazar had this secret wish? Why does the Torah wait all the way until verse 39 when he's retelling the whole story to Rebekah's family, that it sort of spells the word in a weird way, which allows us to suggest he had a hidden agenda? So that's a question that has fascinated commentaries for generations. Again, which is, why does the Torah not reveal or hint at Eleazar's hidden agenda immediately when Abraham first suggests the mission, and he first suggests the possibility that the girl will not come back with him? Why the Torah wait until he's retelling the whole story to her family to allow into what might have been motivating him? So I want to share three insights that have been suggested. One insight is very interesting. We have one of the 10 commandments is lo tachmo, do not envy, right? Don't be jealous, don't envy. And the commentaries point out that how in the world could God command us not to be jealous, not to be envious? You can't control it. If you see something that you really, really want, you just can't squash those feelings. The feelings come up very naturally. So it seems like almost an impossible demand that Torah is making here by telling us don't envy, don't be jealous. So the Ibn Ezra, in his commentary to the 10 Commandments, he says that, when you think about it, he gives an example. He says, imagine there's a palace, and the whole royal family lives there, and there's a beautiful princess, the king's daughter, and once in a while she takes a walk, on the ramparts of the palace, and outside the palace there are these very, very poor peasants that are working the land. And so the Ibn Ezra says, can you imagine that there's one of these very, very poor peasants, and once in a while he's able to look up and see this beautiful princess. He says, do you think that he really inside harbors any fantasy that one day he can marry her? He is so distant from the princess, he realizes that there's no chance in the world. It's just absurd. It's like worse than science fiction. He's got nothing that will ever get him to the stage where he's going to marry the king's daughter. So the Ibn Ezra says that, if we live life properly, we should realize that those things that don't belong to us, we have to basically see them like the prince's daughter. If my neighbor has a nicer car or a nicer house, that's not mine. And if it's not mine, I shouldn't harbor fantasies about me having those things. We should begin to look at everything in life that doesn't belong to us as something that's just totally out of the picture. And that's really an incredible teaching about the Ten Commandments. It's sort of teaching us that we do have the ability to control these inner desires if we're thinking properly. Meaning, if I know and I have really taught myself that things that don't belong to me are totally out of bounds. It would be equivalent to the fantasy of a peasant fantasizing about marrying the princess. There are things that they should have that much connection to us. In our minds, it's that much out of the picture. So what Rav Yitzchak of Vorki, one of the great Hasidic Rebbes, said is that when Eleazar was with Abraham, he would have never dreamed in a million years that his daughter would be worthy of marrying into Abraham's family. He understood that he was a servant, he was a slave, and he wasn't Jewish. He wasn't part of Abraham's family. And he understood how great Abraham was as a great prophet and a great spiritual leader. He understood that, he just was not in the league to have his daughter marry Abraham's son. And that's when Abraham sends him on the mission, it's not even anywhere in his imagination. The Torah doesn't hint at all. There's no mention. The word is not spelt unusually because it's sort of not in the picture at that point that Eliezer is even dreaming that his daughter is going to marry Isaac. But when he finally meets Rebecca's family, he meets these yo-yos, Bethuel and Lavan. I mean, these are some of the lowest people in the world. They're just so mean and tricky and nasty. He now sees his competition, and he says to himself, they're going to marry Abraham's son? This family? They're able to somehow come to marry Abraham's son? So, now that he's with Rebecca's family, it's not so absurd to him that his daughter would be an appropriate match for Isaac. So according to Yitzchak of Vorki, the thing that changes between the original story and the retelling of the story is that originally he wouldn't have dreamt of his daughter marrying Isaac. It only becomes something that he is dreaming about, and sort of it enters his subconscious at this point when he sees, who he's, who the future family of Isaac is going to be. He now says to himself, maybe it wouldn't be so absurd for me to be in the running. Another of the commentaries, the Chaim Soloveitchik points out, and it's really in the simple reading of the story, that it would have made sense for Eleazar to express this concern to Abraham that maybe the girl won't want to follow me back. Meaning that Abraham sends him on a mission. You go far away, bring back a wife for Isaac. And it's not an absurd thing to raise, an absurd concern to say at that point, my master, what if the girl will not follow me back? It could be a real problem. And so Eleazar wants to know. So at the beginning of the story, when Abraham first sends him on the mission, it's not an inappropriate question for him to be asking. The problem is later on, when the deal has been made already, the match has been made, and everyone's, they've drunk on it. They said l'chaim, and the story's over already. So here, when he's retelling the story now, sort of, he's sitting on their couch in the living room, and he's giving them the whole history of what happened. There's no purpose in telling them, and I said to Abraham, what if the girl's not going to want to come back with me? Why would he tell that to them? They don't need to know that. And so the commentaries suggest here that that's the indication now that he really did have a hidden agenda, meaning when he raised this concern to Abraham, it was a perfectly legitimate concern. Now that he's telling the story to their family, the only reason he might be telling this to Rebekah's family is to maybe plant some seeds of doubt in her family's mind about whether or not she should be going back with him. I mean that, once the sale is made, you don't start questioning the product or raising doubts in the mind of the buyer. And so the fact that Eleazar, in retelling the story to Rebekah's family here, is raising this point, which is not relevant, it's not necessary. The commentaries say this sort of reveals his hidden agenda, to make things work out, that the girl will not want to come back with me. He's putting this in their mind. And he's sort of secretly hoping that, yes, she won't come back, so that my daughter will be able to marry Isaac. And finally, one final approach is by the Kutzker Rebbe, Menachem Mendel of Kutsk, who says that, initially, because he was engaged in doing this mitzvah, he was really fulfilling his master's mission. He was doing something that was altruistic. He was very involved in this mission to find a wife for Isaac. He wasn't really aware, meaning that his sort of deep-seated desires and his hidden motives, he wasn't really aware of them. He wasn't in touch with what was really going deep. He was deep down inside of himself. He wasn't aware of what his secret desires were. They were there, but he wasn't aware of it. And because he wasn't aware of it, the Torah doesn't clue us into it back in verse 5. But when he finally completes the mission, and now it's a done deal, and there's no chance in the world that he's going to have his daughter marrying Isaac, because already it's been decided that Rebekah's going to be the one. So now that all his sort of inner hopes are squashed, now he's sort of able to see them more clearly. And so what the Kutzker Rebbe says is that, he was just not able to see his inner subconscious dreams and desires while it was still possible. It's only after, those dreams are totally squashed and they're irrelevant that he really comes to the realization that, what he really did. He himself becomes aware of the fact that, going back to the very beginning, he did have these secret desires. There's a lot more on this topic, but I think I'm going to move on to one last. It's not going to be long. I just want to throw out something that's just fascinating, but needs further study. If you go to 25 verse 6, it speaks about Abraham. There at the end of the chapter, it speaks about Abraham taking some concubines and having a lot more children. And it's interestingly, it tells us in verse 6 in chapter 25 that Abraham gave gifts to these children of the concubines, and he sent them to the east. Now, it doesn't seem to be a particularly meaningful verse, but in the Jewish mystical sources, in the Zohar and in other sources, it talks about what these gifts were. And the mystical sources say that he gave them mystical knowledge about spiritual forces in the world, how to negotiate these spiritual forces. And what's interesting is that our tradition teaches that he sent them to the East. And many commentaries, by the way, and those ancient sources say that these were real, legitimate mystical teachings, spiritual teachings that were transported to the East, but then they became corrupted into more or less idolatrous kinds of practices. But there are many modern commentaries that suggest, just throwing this out there as a suggestion, that if you study Eastern religions, particularly Hinduism, you'll find many, many similarities between Hinduism and Judaism, both in many of the words that are held in common and even in some spiritual ideas. Rabbi Glazerson, Matisyahu Glazerson, wrote an entire book. It had two titles. One version was called Judaism and the Grandeur of the East, and the other one was called Judaism and Hinduism, where he shows many of the parallels between Jewish mystical teachings and Hinduism. And so some of the commentaries say that this might be the origin of those spiritual teachings that go all the way back to Abraham, who sends the children of his concubines to the East with these gifts. And the gifts were not packages of coffee and chocolate, but that they were spiritual teachings that made their way into Eastern religions. So that's just food for thought, and that'll bring to the close what I wanted to share on Chayei Sarah. Again, there's a tremendous amount beyond this, but I hope this was interesting for the viewers, and I wish everyone a wonderful rest of the week and a blessed Shabbat Shalom, and we should all only be able to grow in our knowledge of the Torah and our love of the Torah and our appreciation of how deep the Torah is.
Yes, amen. Amen, Rabbi. Thank you for a wonderful Torah Parsha. I really appreciate all you put into it and all the time you spent investing into this series. So, and we'll see you somewhere in the ballpark of 5 to 6 weeks again on this Torah Talk. But we'll also see you Sunday. For all of you who are watching and are expecting to see Rabbi tomorrow night, you won't see him tomorrow night.
Unless you're in Toronto. I'm teaching in Toronto tomorrow.
There you go. Now, on Tanakh Talk, where I'm actually shifting every scheduled event that's on a pre-scheduled setup is all going to be done on Sundays from here on. I'll leave Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday randomly open for special series, like maybe something like, History of Tanakh with Rabbi Skobac. I don't know. We'll see. But we'll use one of those days for that. But the regular scheduled events will be on Sundays from now on, starting early. So for me, that means I'll be in the studio for probably about 14 hours. But we'll be able to get everything out in one nice package. So, and it'll also free me up for work more during the week as well. So, Rabbi, thank you so much. It's been awesome as usual. And
thank you so much. And, you should be... I'm always blown away by how much you're doing and how far your efforts are reaching. And so I just want to thank you and encourage you and, say that what you're doing is quite astounding and incredible. Thank you, Rabbi. And, it amazes me that I'm still amazed that you and Rabbi Singer actually agreed to come on to Tanakh Talk. The way that all fell together was just like, that was definitely Hashem, no doubt. Because if you guys knew me, you would have been like, oh, no, I don't think so. Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. Rabbi, thank you so much for your encouragement. We love you much. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you. I'll see you all Sunday. So if you want to send me email with questions for either Rabbi Skobac or for Rabbi Singer, you can do that to, once again, tanakhtalkquestions@gmail.com. You can follow Rabbi Skobac, jewsforjudaism.ca. You can look him up on YouTube. Also, the website, you can subscribe there. You can also donate there if you want to contribute to what they're doing. And that's about it. So, Rabbi, until next time, shalom to you and Shabbat shalom to you and everyone else. God bless. God bless. Love you guys. We'll see you next time. Shalom, shalom.